Hello and welcome. My name is John Fawcett and this is the Resilience Interview. Today I'm talking with Sam Farmer. Sam's a psychologist and leadership coach. He's the owner-director of Enhanced Facilitation based in Auckland, New Zealand. Sam has extensive international experience in the areas of psychosocial support and the training of professionals working in high emotional impact environments. This means he's worked in locations such as Haiti, Afghanistan, Nigeria, South Sudan, Papua New Guinea, and in Christchurch, New Zealand following the earthquake of 2011. Sam's a founder member and past honorary vice president of the International Society for Coaching Psychology and also co-established the organisation Humanitarian Psychology, Australia and New Zealand. Sam, it's a real privilege to have you with us today. Welcome. Can you describe resilience? What kind of words would you use to describe resilience?
I think words like other people do as well. So things like bouncing back from adversity and so on. And I think something I'm picking up a lot more as I read about it is the ability to sustain that bounce back. So it isn't just about bouncing back, but it's about being able to keep going even though circumstances can be quite difficult. So especially in the humanitarian context, it's not just about kind of surviving an incident, it's keeping going even if that incident continues or after the incident.
So when I think of bouncing back, I think of something like a rubber band, being restored to its original shape after it's been stretched. But you're talking about also the ability for the rubber to sustain that stretchiness and not use it up and not be rubber any longer.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because when you said elastic band, that's always kind of feels a lot of stretch in there, and that can be a lot of tension and a lot of burnout perhaps with that. So I think it is actually being able to keep going and almost grow from the experience rather than so you're kind of there's a new state, if you like, afterwards.
And that's a new thing in thinking about resilience, isn't it? Because in the past it used to be that resilience was purely the bouncing back from an event, but now this element of growth and continuing to grow from the experience has been added to it. It changes the ideas about resilience, doesn't it?
I think so. They're starting to develop surveys and so on about post-traumatic growth, so it kind of is consistent with the research around that. There's people talking about the growing from.
Where does our resilience come from?
I think a number of places. I think it's something that we build over time amongst ourselves, and I think also it comes from the environment or the social environment in which we find ourselves. So in terms of us developing it over time might be perhaps we've faced difficult circumstances in the past and noticed how we've survived those times. We have more trust and confidence in ourselves. I suppose it's about building our own sense of who we are. And that develops over time throughout our lives. And the other thing that I think where it comes from is our social context, as I said. So it might be the team that is around us and that sustains us on a continued period, or it might be the family that's around us or near, in contact. And I suppose that's why the social support or people around us is very important in terms of sustaining resilience, because it's not something we can do on our own over a long period of time. I don't think that's possible. Do
you think that human beings are kind of born with resilience? I mean, is it one of those inherent characteristics of a human being that there is some kind of resilience that we have as we're born?
I think that's an important part of it. I guess some of us are perhaps more predisposed to being more resilient than others, but I think I'm one of those people who believes very much in the nurture side of things. Yeah. So I think it's something that we can very much develop over time with the support of others and from our own experiences. So I think even if we had, let's say, a weaker predisposition, I think all of us can be resilient in different circumstances. And I think so resilience can also be quite relative.
Right.
So I wouldn't be very resilient, for instance, in a big social environment. I'd be pretty scared and not sure how to sustain myself, although hopefully I would do. But perhaps in other environments, let's say whitewater rafting or something, I'd feel quite resilient. Right. So I think we have different ideas of what resilient is, or the circuit contexts.
Right. And taking, say, the example of the whitewater rafting, your resilience and I guess your your peacefulness about being in whitewater rafting has been something that's built up over experience. It's
Yeah.
as you've learned how to do that.
I think so. And then if we're talking about risk, because let's say whitewater rafting or the kind of humanitarian context that you come into, people, you can't just suddenly go into that kind of context. I think it takes time, as you say, to experience risk, to experience living on the edge, if you like, whether it's, I don't know, for the first time as a child going shopping on your own, and you work your way up to quite difficult environments. And so with whitewater rafting, perhaps you first of all go on a grade 1 or whatever, and you notice that actually you can survive that particular experience, and so you carry on to higher and higher ones. But I guess people are different in the rate and the severity with which they can go into those.
And it would seem, therefore, that like whitewater rafting and also going into humanitarian emergencies, that the nurturing and the teaching that a team or a group provides for someone going into that is an important part of developing and growing resilience.
Yeah, I think that's another important part of being resilient in kind of the real world or the humanitarian world is the importance of preparation. I think you're going to be more resilient if you know what to expect and to anticipate some of those things. I think that can help your resilience, and so both information and ongoing support provided by your team's really important, and the trusting relationship between them. Yeah.
How important is the support of others in terms of building and sustaining and maintaining resilience? Is it easy to do as an individual, or is it something that is significantly enhanced by having a supportive social network?
I haven't read enough about this, and so I think I'm really calling on my own experience. And I think, there are some people who do actually survive pretty well on their own without other people. They survive in really difficult situations that no one else would be able to cope with. And there are others of us, and perhaps I'm amongst those, who would survive better knowing and trusting that that there are other people around us, and that takes time to build trust that people are going to be there to support us. That perhaps they can take some of the strain. We might be able to take certain aspects of the strain, but we can perhaps relax it a little bit while someone else takes the strain. So for me, the teamwork's really important. But I think perhaps the other thing is, and I think maybe we need to be careful when we read the literature and talk about resilience, is it's not something that kind of occur. When we talk about resilience, I think we talk about lots of other things at the same time. It can't just occur on its own. Like we talk about teamwork, we talk about trust, expectations, lots of other things as well.
Is there, we've talked about in the literature, and quite commonly people talk about coping ability, that resilience is another word for resilience is our coping ability. But we've used the phrase, there are some people who can't cope, or we can no longer cope. So what is it that's actually breaking our resilience down or wearing our resilience down when we're saying, I can no longer cope, or that person can no longer cope? What is it that's actually happening?
Thank you for bringing in the idea of coping as well. I think that's part of it. I think things that can't, so maybe lack of experience, so a less resilient person may have less coping strategies. I think there are some fundamental basics around your coping skills or your resiliency, and that's basic, things, the physical part of it, you have a decent amount of exercise, decent amount of rest, a decent diet, those all contributes as a holistic approach that I would take to resilience. So those things, as well as the head stuff, the psychological stuff. So what might break it down is little respite. So, and in the humanitarian people's resilience breaks down if they don't have rest, if they're burning out, exhausting themselves mentally and physically. I think I don't know a lot about it, but spiritually, I think people would also, if they have that lack of faith or lose faith, and if certainly my experience and my reading is that, people with a strong faith can also sustain a high level of resilience. Certainly when I worked in Afghanistan, people have grown up through decades of war, and they're amazing how resilient that they are, and they have a very strong faith in Allah. And so I think the things that break it down is kind of learned helplessness as well, is kind of knowing that you just kind of giving up, you can't control things, but perhaps in a way that's also part of resilience, is learning not to try and control everything, but just focus on the things you can control and have satisfaction with that. You look at Viktor Frankl in was it the Man's Pursuit of Meaning? I think his book was something like that. And he lost lots of things, but he sustained his resilience just because he could control what he thought, and he recognised that, he can control whether he wanted to appreciate the world that was around him or not, the beauty of nature, and so on. And I think if we lose that perspective of our desire to control things, I think it's more likely that we'll become less resilient.
It's interesting you said that. I was reminded of something I read, and I don't know the reference for it, where they suggested the difference between cultures, and a culture where individual children are led to have the belief that they can take control of their lives. Those individuals might be more susceptible to devastating psychological impact when they find out they can't, compared with people growing up in a culture where you're taught there's very little you can do, and what you should do is basically, do the things that the community's doing. Don't worry about the things you can't do, and you'll get through. And it's interesting about the cultural differences in terms of resilience, and whether you've seen any cultural differences in terms of how people build their resilience or cope.
Well, this is the whole complexity, isn't it? Because I think expectations are important, and there's kind of this balance, if you like, between learned helplessness, where you can't control everything, and it's kind of like, well, there are things you can control, but don't raise your expectations too high. Yeah. So, I don't have a kind of definitive more comment to what you've already said about that. No.
Can I go back to you said faith, and I'm interested in that because there's been quite a lot talked about mindfulness, which is not quite the same thing as faith, but it's connected to theories of hope and ideas about the future. When you used the word faith, were you thinking of a religion, or were you thinking of something as a broader definition of faith?
I think when I first said it, it was more of a broad definition, but I brought it down to religion.
Right.
But I think hope is, and that would be, I think, an important part of resilience is having hope, but based on realistic expectations. So hope, and perhaps it's about not taking things totally personally. Hope. I find that difficult to quantify further than what you're saying. I can't add to that.
Okay, that's interesting, because I've heard faith being used in the context of those who are very religious in that, but I've also heard it in the context of people who are talking about, do you believe that there's going to be a good tomorrow, or do you believe that there's a future for our people or for our family? And they've used in that context about faith in the kind of the goodness of the future. Yeah,
so I think both of those are helpful to understand. So I think where people have a faith in Allah or God or whatever their spiritual faith is, I think people can sustain it. Again, I think if it's realistic, and also I think certainly in Afghanistan, it's the will of Allah was often the kind of expression, and so it was almost fatalistic in the sense that we don't have control, but Allah does, and we trust in Allah.
Yeah.
And then what you're saying is a faith in a good tomorrow, perhaps, which is more broad. I think also keeps people going, as long as they're not expecting too much for tomorrow, but the fact that you can wake up and still participate in the day to whatever degree it is, the fact that you open your eyes and move a muscle, you can make choices around that.
Right.
So I think if you keep your expectations at a realistic level, I think that faith can continue.
Choices. How important are choices in terms of maintaining resilience?
I think, as we've been talking, one of the things I've been thinking about is the women that I've seen in Papua New Guinea, and in terms of thinking about choice, and their choice is very limited. Like for a lot of them, their experience is violence on a continued basis within the home, and I think their resilience, the demand on their resilience is huge to survive and for their family. So in terms of choice, I think choice is very important, and so our work there is around enabling them to focus on the limited choices that they do have. And so I suppose that is important, because people, if they don't see they have any choice but to suffer and to endure, I think then they lose that resilience. And I think so a lot of experience for women is that their experience is they've got very little choice about what can happen, and so they start to suffer because they cannot see that they have a choice to do anything.
This sounds like a leading question, but in terms of coaching and psychology, is part of, therefore, what you would do to try and help people determine what choices they actually do have? Kind of not manufacture fake choices, but kind of open up some perspectives of different choices that people can have?
And this goes back to your cultural definition, I think, as well, because it's all very well me as a Westerner with the, really, I'm really lucky with the choices I have. I have lots of choices as I'm coming in and telling these Papua New Guinean people or these Afghanis that they've got choices, and I think that's, they've been living with those limited choices. I think as a coach or a psychologist, I think our role is perhaps to, first of all, recognise the strengths they have, which sometimes they forget because there's often very little hope. And they lose sight of the opportunities and choices they do have. So our first role is to recognise their context and to be explicit about that. And then another part of our role then is to start to say, okay, even the limited choices that you do have, how can we either give those more weight or even grow those? And also notice this, and especially notice the strengths and the choices, and the strengths, the actions they do take to keep themselves going from day to day. And noticing that, I think, helps to restore their resilience, so that you're kind of creating some kind of hope. Hey, you've lived 20, 30, 40 years through this. What have you done to do this? Who else have you called upon? How have you sustained this? Is it God, or is it family members, or is it your own strength of willpower, or is it your child, or what is it that's sustaining you? Or is it your diet? Whatever it is, kind of focusing on what those are to keep them going. And then, so that's starting to kind of help them to recognise choice.
Right. And then that raised for me the idea in terms of context. If we were working with people who were wanting to go and help people who had been through an earthquake or a tsunami or a civil war, and we asked them, what are the things that you do to look after yourselves? Those things might not be available to them when they go to Afghanistan, because they might be social things that they were doing locally here, but when they get there, those are not available. So how do we help people who are moving contexts to identify different ways of maintaining and sustaining their resilience?
So let me clarify. So you're saying expats going overseas?
It could be, it could be expats going overseas, or it could be, it could be as simple as a new blended family,
right?
Or leaving home,
right,
as a kid and going to uni for the first time. And when I was at home, I used to know that when I got home, the meal was on the table, and I could watch TV and I could go to bed, and someone would do the laundry for me. Go to uni, and all that's gone, and so I have to learn new ways of doing it. I'm just wondering if there's ways in which we could structure that, in the sense of saying, okay, preparing you for a new context. How would we go about that? What are the key things we're looking for in that?
I think, well, the first is you mentioned, and I was saying before, I think important things about preparation is really, really crucial.
Right.
So reading, asking, watching TV, whatever, to get a sense of what might be there. And also perhaps some rehearsal, what if situations you might want to do before you go. I know some humanitarian contexts of organisations, what they'll do is they'll ask the people coming into that environment to contact them to find out what else is going on. I think one of the other things, and perhaps not enough weight is given to this by people moving into a new environment, is actually to watch, rather than kind of jump in and think use your old coping skills, is perhaps to trust that you will cope, and in that trust perhaps suspend your usual ways of coping to watch how other people cope. What are the things that they do? Who do they talk to? How do they deal with certain situations that come up? And I think that's one of the things that certainly in my cultural background, people from a similar cultural background to me, don't spend enough time watching before they act.
Right. And part of that's to do with the context, isn't it? You and I have both done emergency responses where we're expected to hit the ground running, and the context is often so dire that we ourselves know we have to hit the ground running. And it seems counterintuitive then to sit back and say, okay, let me watch what's going on. Yet you're saying that's quite an important part of what we do. Somewhere we have to keep watching as we are responding.
I think that's a good challenge, and I think maybe it's not, perhaps I need to be clearer then, is not kind of suspending any action at all, but it's as we kind of maintain we hit the ground running and we maintain what we need to, maybe find out crucial things like where do we sleep and where do we eat, and who do I need to be in contact with, those security issues. Those are really important to lay out first and foremost. And then perhaps the other things in parallel is also observe as we're surviving from minute to minute, because often it is minute to minute, also kind of looking, okay, so what do people do? It might involve not kind of, well, let me give you an example, was we were told we were entering a certain area, and we weren't sure whether we should wear our vest or not that represented our organisation. And by just looking around, seeing what other people were doing, we could understand what we should do. So I think it is being careful not to slip on the vest straight away, because that's what we do in all circumstances. It's kind of like, well, what are other people doing in this situation?
Yeah. The other thing that happens, isn't it, when we're using our skills, our resilience skills, in a new context or in a high impact context, is that we're using quite a lot of internal energy to keep ourselves alert and responsive and appropriate. We don't have an infinite supply of energy, do we? We can use it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And how do we know that it's time for us to take a break? What tells us that it's time to take a break?
Oh, so my personal experience is probably not, it's useful perhaps for some people and not for others. So my personal experience is, I know I'm going to be going into, when I do my visits to the field, I'm only ever going for 2 weeks. And so I just know that's how much energy I need to kind of pace myself for. And so I'm happy to work longer days and those kinds of things. I think if I'm going into the field, and what I've observed from the people I work with, if they're going for long times, is to pace themselves and make sure they're getting sleep at the right time. And again, hear from others about what do you need to do to rest. When's a good time to rest? Is there? I think in one place I visited, there was okay to have an afternoon nap, but then you'd work after your afternoon nap or whatever. And it's just finding out when your quiet periods are and so on. So again, it's that preparation and perhaps. And it's very difficult in an emergency context to think this, but being careful about how much energy you give to every individual or every meeting or whatever. Make choices about, is this an important meeting I need to go to? Is this an important conversation that I need to have? Or can I actually leave it or postpone it until later? Can I make arrangements for another time, rather than kind of be 100% of the time? It's just, well, maybe there's an approach called acceptance and commitment therapy, and one of the things is about knowing your limits and accepting that you cannot be all things to all people all the time. So accept what you can be and be confident that that's okay, and being honest to yourself, being true to yourself if you want to survive. Knowing your limits sounds like it could be hard work, to learn what my limits actually are. And you won't often know. No, and is that something or other that it's useful to have people helping you do? Someone who knows what they're doing in terms of helping you? Yeah, and I think people... That's what sometimes they'll have organisations that have people outside the field who kind of check in and say who keep asking those questions. That's why I do my job is psychologists going into the field, providing psychosocial support to ask, are you acting within your limits? Team leaders need to know about asking those kinds of questions. I think the other thing is maybe taking. I suppose the other thing is again, when people go into the field or in difficult situations, we're not fresh people. We've learned over time what our limits are. And I think maybe also thinking about what have I done in the past to when I've gone into completely new situations where I'm totally out of my depth and I'm going to spend lots of energy. I should be knowledgeable and wise enough to know that I'm going into a difficult situation. I should be knowledgeable and wise enough to know that I haven't got 100% of the time. What have I done in the past when I've gone into similar situations? How have I coped? What have I noticed about my limitations? So perhaps one of the other questions to ask ourselves is, what are my limitations, and being honest about what those limitations are, and letting other people know what the limitations are. Because that's the other part of it, isn't it? Not keeping all that to ourselves is something about sharing that appropriately with the people that we're working with. I think so. Yeah. And also, so that's part of the interview process, if you like, before you go into any difficult situations. The people who take you in is perhaps making them aware from the start, even if, and that's perhaps the hardest thing, because we like to show ourselves as being able to cope with all situations and not being scared. But in the long term, if we're not honest to people whom we're going to be with about what our limitations are, I think we let both ourselves and everyone else down. So there's two types, well, I mean, there's many types, but there's two broad types of events that can cause us to be tired and to wear down. One of them is the short exposure to high risk environments, like a 2-week deployment to a disaster zone. The other one is that kind of ongoing, long-term, chronic wearing down. That's, to me, sometimes seems to be harder to actually see what's happening on, because it is
over time.
Yeah, and I think that's for me. That's perhaps the one when you really see resilience. Perhaps, I mean, if we're thrown into a 2-week situation, we know at the end of it we're going to be pulled out, or we'll recover. I think if there's an indefinite period, or 3 to 6 months, I mean, that's a long, or longer. That's a long, long time, and so those are about knowing, and that's, I guess, what we do as psychologists, is enable people to kind of to identify break periods, perhaps to make plans. I'm just reading up about, in the case of being kidnapped, I'm just about to go to a zone where that's a risk, and so how to cope with that. I think one of the things is planning your days. Is knowing from one day to the next. Breaking your days down into particular sections, so that there's your choice and control, I guess, again. So I think, I don't know if the word's being mindful, but very, very aware of the segments of each day, of each week, of each month, of each year going forward. And I think if you can do that, then you're maintaining some control over how you engage with life, even if lots against you. It's the importance of being able to notice the opportunities when they occur, and to plan for your breaks, plan for your feed, plan for your social interactions, and those kind of things. And I think that's how resilience is sustained over a long period of time.
It's and I'm not expecting you to have the definitive answer on this one, but one of the questions that often come to my mind is, when we go to emergency context, we hire a lot of local people who have survived whatever that context is to come in and also work alongside the humanitarian response. Their story is a bit different because they're not likely to be able to leave. So they've survived this crisis. They are now working with something or other that has purpose and meaning, but there's an expectation that they will continue to live there. How do we, in that kind of context, what's the best advice we can give people in terms of managing and sustaining their resilience for those folk?
I suppose one of the first things that makes me think, as you were talking, is I think sometimes we have we have the same expectations of national staff, the locals, as we do of expats. So expats go in, although it is changing, with the idea of doing good and making a difference and all those things. And those kind of expectations of making a difference, I think, often set people up for a bit of a fall, because they can't, it feels like sometimes they can't make a difference, and then their expectations get dashed and they become less resilient, they become burnt out. What surprises expats sometimes is national staff often do it because it's a job, and perhaps their resilience is sustainable because they don't have these huge expectations. So the learning for us as expats is perhaps to take a leaf out of the national staff, is that this is a job. There are only so many things you can do in an 8-hour day, and if you try and cram 24 hours into a 24-hour day, you're just going to be very unproductive. If you're going to be there for the long term, you need to be doing what you can in the working period that you're allotted, but you cannot do more than that. And if and so our job, I suppose, is recognising that. And in terms of encouraging national staff, it's also recognising and encouraging them to look after their families, to be part of the community, to justify and accept and normalise the fact that it's okay if they only want to work 8 hours. It's a fairly normal thing to be doing.
Right, so that sounds like a very pragmatic and structured approach to life, and that sounds like the kind of rule that could be applied by anybody almost in any context, anywhere. They don't have to be humanitarian workers.
True.
They could just be people ordinarily going about an ordinary life in any context. Balance.
Thank you. Yeah,
what
absolutely.
You do.
Yeah. So maybe that's the thing, is about having balance. So. And obviously in a humanitarian context that's difficult, especially for the locals. But in our context, I think balance is something that's really important. For leaders that we work with, in New Zealand, for instance, they try and take on too much, and they've got competing priorities all the time, and they kind of lose sight of the need for balance, and they burn out and so on. And so it is very much what's important to you. What do you value in life? Those are so do what's important to you. Do what you value. So take time for your family, take time for yourself, take time for exercise, and take time for your work.
I find it for myself, it's often useful to have someone remind me that, stop focusing just on this. Think about the other things that you value in life. And I just wonder whether that's part of the training process or the competency process for a team of people going into some kind of context like that is we need to take time to look at ourselves and our own needs, and where are we going to find those?
And that's so difficult when you are working in a situation where this information is coming all the time, casualties are coming in here, and it's just very difficult to then, as you say, take stock. And so that's our role, and that's the leader's role, to kind of enable their teams to take stock as often as they can.
Now, this is another one of those broad questions, but if you looked at an individual human being over the course of a life, would you expect them or hope that they would have more resilience at the end of their life or less?
Goodness, I've never really thought about that. I mean, again, it depends. It must depend, I guess. Sure.
Is it always certain that we're going to be worn down by life and we're going to have less at the end? Or is that a myth? And in fact, is it possible that we can continue to build and sustain our resilience throughout our life, and actually we can find in each new day something or other that actually is kind of adding to it and we're growing rather than being worn down until we die?
Yeah. I mean, there's some obvious examples. I suppose for me, then you've got to argue that maybe there is a bit of a nature debate. I mean, people like Nelson Mandela or someone like that, he was born, well, that's my opinion. But in terms of, people like that, it was growing all the time. He wasn't worn down as far as I could see.
Right.
And I'm sure there are people who do grow all the time. I would argue, without evidence, so I'd have to find evidence, but I would argue that we do grow. If we're resilient, I don't think we necessarily get ground down. I think if we're prepared to have an attitude that is about hope, about being realistic, about taking care of ourselves, then we won't be ground down. We're more likely to have grown from that experience, be a richer, wiser individual.
So resilience isn't just for special people who have special skills, it's for all of us.
I think so. And so the more I'm talking with you now, the more I'm thinking, actually, I would have thought we increase our resilience over time, as long as we're supported and take those rests.
Right, so that would be in terms of, we often talk about risk factors in terms of our lives, and you've mentioned a couple of times the idea of the social support, having people around us who can support us, and that would be one of those risk factors that you identify, would it? If we become isolated, we're at a higher risk?
I mean, I guess, there's always exceptions, but I think as we tend to be social beings, and I would have thought for most people, we need that social support around us, and the majority of people will need that social support to maintain their resilience, and certainly breaks from the critical situations. Yeah. But I don't know enough about the resilience in terms of people in Papua New Guinea or Haiti or Afghanistan or wherever. Are they ground down or are they richer for it? I don't know. I wonder.
Which is a really interesting question, isn't it? Because some experts or so-called experts assume that you can transfer diagnosis and assessments from one culture to another, just like that. But actually, you're doing a really good thing by saying, I don't know, so before we assume, we should actually find out.
Yeah, that's a really good. Definitely, people survive those things more than I would ever do.
Yeah.
But maybe they survive more because they've grown up. I don't know, but I think that's right. I think that we do need to look more. But certainly people survive that. But whether they're not ground down by it, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, are they better for it, or are they surviving?
Are they just surviving, or are they better for it?
A very good theoretical and scientific question, which needs to be researched further. Where do you recommend, or do you have any recommendations about where we could go to find out more about resilience if we were interested?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends what kind of resilience we're interested in. I mean, I've just heard about post-traumatic growth. I mean, when I started hearing about it, some of the studies were done on the people who went to the Antarctic, which is a fairly pedestrian environment compared to, the humanitarian context. But nonetheless, those are pretty demanding environments. In terms, also about being resilient in, a limited social environment and a very difficult natural environment. Perhaps we also look at, read books by, explorers and so on. And maybe it depends on the type of people we are, because perhaps if I was a very religious person, I'd probably look at, not necessarily the Bible, but I'd look at books written by people who've gone through horrible experiences and survived, religious people who've managed to sustain their faith in God or Allah or whatever. So those things will be important for me to read. So But in terms of specific references, I can't think of particular place to go apart from kind of put into Google resilience, post-traumatic growth, those kinds of things.
Many cultures, it just reminded me, many cultures have kind of heroes, don't they?
Exactly.
Some of them are mythical heroes and some of them are real life heroes, people who have survived against the odds, and we can use those perhaps as examples of how it's possible to survive against the odds and grow and develop.
And so I'm just thinking also about, was it Mandela, the young lady who survived?
Oh, Malala?
Malala, sorry,
Yes.
Malala, not Mandela. Malala, who survived being shot in Pakistan, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Afghanistan.
Yes, that's right.
Pakistan. Yeah. And, how did she survive? So I think maybe it's reading those stories. And I think also it's what your outlook on life is. And I guess that's something, the sooner we develop a positive or constructive, a hopeful attitude towards life, the more likely it is we'll build that resilience. So you and I are a little bit older and hopefully we have a relatively positive outlook. But I look at young children now who are very hopeful and some who are less hopeful. And so perhaps we nurture, in terms of the next generation or the next generations, is if we can nurture as much hope as we can in children and other people, then they can grow up with that positive outlook. And for ourselves, being mindful about the environment we have and seeing the good in things rather than looking for the bad, so that we're training our mind. So I think it is a psychological exercise we need to do for resilience, is train our mind to notice all the things that are around us that make us feel good about where we are, so that we're not over-focused perhaps on comfort things, but also thinking about, just basically that we can breathe, or that there's, I don't know, an environment around us that proves that we can see, or proves that we can hear, or whatever.
So it's an intentional process, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
We just can't just let it happen. We really need to make a choice to pay attention to what's going on around us and what it is that sustains us.
And not just the negative things. This is a really bad situation. I mean, it's more, okay, so what is it about that, I'm still here, I'm still alive, I'm still talking, whatever it is.
Right. Yeah. So because it's complex, it's not something rather we should just let drift. We should be paying attention to it and seeing what works for us and what doesn't work for us, noting those down. On an
everyday basis, that we become fluent, if you like.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to bring this to a close, but is there anything, Sam, that you wanted to tell us about resilience that I haven't asked you about?
No, I think you've asked lots of things that I haven't really thought about, so thank you for that. And obviously all my views are very personal, so I hope people take something from it.
Thank you, Sam. For those of you who want to get in touch with Sam or read more about him, I'll put his contact details at the end of this video and you'll be able to find him there.
Thanks
so thank
very
you
much,
again
John.
for being here today. Thank you.
Thanks.